Santa Claus, the original hippie.
So to heck with old Santa Claus. When he goes dashing through the snow, I hope he falls.
He smiled as he said, with a twinkle in his eye, Merry Christmas to all, now you're all gonna die.
Christmas with the devil.
Welcome to the Weird Christmas Podcast. I am Craig Kringle, your host. Thought I'd try this out this year since we have over a few thousand followers scattered around Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook. Thank you all so much for having fun with me as I post all those crazy cards. But I wanted to offer something a little bit different since, like I said, we're starting to get a large community around these few sites, and I'm making a lot of friends in a lot of different places. So thank you all so much. And no, my last name is really not Kringle. I'm not sure how many episodes we're going to get out of this, but I hope to at least get 4 or 5 throughout December before Christmas time. Got a couple interviews lined up. In fact, that's what our first episode is going to be today, an interview with a writer of an excellent book that I just read this last month that I really hope you'll pick up too. But otherwise, we got some weird music we're going to share, a couple other ideas, and if you have any fun ideas, please let me know as well. You can get in touch with me on Tumblr, which is where I think the majority of people are. You can also find me on Twitter. Weird_Christmas is what I am there. There is another guy named Weird Christmas there who I'm friends with. Fun guy out of the UK. Just a weirdo. Doesn't really post any sort of Christmas stuff, but real fun guy. Or any of the other places where you might see me. I'm going to get an email up to Just for Weird Christmas that will be on the website.
Edit. It's weirdxmas@gmail.com.
You can also follow the written blog I've been trying to keep up at WordPress, which is just weirdchristmas.wordpress.com. So, without further ado, let's jump into it. But before we get started with the interview for our first episode, let's listen to a good classic Christmas carol.
Whether you're Christian, Muslim, or Jew, happy holidays. Any old dance that you like to do, happy holidays. Eat, bite, drink up, nibble, gobble, chew, happy holidays. Believe what you want to, nothing's really true. Happy holidays. Marry something to you. Marry something to you. Marry something to you. Marry something.
Now I'm feeling festive. David Kyle Johnson is a writer who just last year came out with a book called The Myths That Stole Christmas, 7 Misconceptions That Hijacked the Holiday and How We Can Take It Back. A really, really fun book. Kyle is a philosopher he's an associate professor of philosophy at King's College in Pennsylvania. And this book, I think, is something that a lot of folk who enjoy the kind of sense of humor I have on the site will appreciate too. But it's also really good. And there's a nice mix here of really being someone who, like me, is just in love with the holidays, but also loves the history and loves to really know some of the truth and some of the changes of things that have happened over time, and has a good bit of fun poking fun at it along the way. So like I said, Kyle is an associate professor of philosophy at King's College in Pennsylvania. He has just written this book, but he's also written a lot. He has blogs on the Huffington Post, on Psychology Today, and I'll have some links to those on the WordPress site and other places. But he's also edited a few books on philosophy and pop culture in particular, as well as a number of traditional academic essays and publications. But he's written one called Inception in Philosophy, and edited one called Inception in Philosophy and Heroes in Philosophy. He's also done 2 courses for a lecture company that if you don't know about, I encourage you to look up. It's called The Great Courses. I used to have a long commute and listen to a ton of these. Really informative, really well done with excellent professors. The 2 that he's done are called first Big Questions in Philosophy, and the second called Exploring Metaphysics. Kyle, thank you very much for doing this, and welcome to the very first podcast, and thank you so much for being the first one for me.
Thanks for having me, Craig.
Well, if you don't mind, would you just give a quick summary of the book so that those who haven't read it can, know what's going on?
Yeah, so The Myth That Stole Christmas is a kind of unusual book. when I summarize it, it almost sounds like a self-help book because it's about like how to celebrate the holiday in a better way. And if you're frustrated with with Christmas, what can you do about it? How can you make Christmas better work for you? And so it kind of sounds like a self-help book in that kind of way, but it's really nothing of the kind. Um, it's it's really it's well, the story about how I came to write it is a little bit different, but it's birthed out of a frustration, or it kind of starts out by pointing to frustrations that people have with Christmas, about spending, about parties, about obligations that we don't want forced upon us, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
That everybody is thinks Christmas, like Christmas could be better than it is, right? And people get frustrated with Christmas, and so it's kind of an attempt to empower people in a certain kind of way to realize there actually is something that you can do about this. You don't have to be a slave to it. You can actually make Christmas what you want it to be and celebrate it in however, whatever way pretty much you want to. And there's nothing wrong with that. But in an attempt to try to make that case, I really dig into the historical details of Christmas and where it comes from and what its true origins are and like true historical origins are. And then I'll make arguments against Christmas spending. I talk about the war on Christmas in one chapter. I talk about the Santa Claus lie, right? So it's a way to kind of explore like really the kind of you could make Christmas better is all kind of an excuse to explore all of these issues that surround Christmas that I find really fascinating and interesting, and that a lot of people don't know. I think Christmas is one of the things that's most shrouded in myth. Like there's all these misconceptions about what Christmas is and where it comes from, and it feeds into making Christmas a worse holiday. And so I'm just trying to make it better. Yeah, there's a quick
Great.
overview anyway.
No, that's great. That's wonderful. I think that I think that's a good service. Done a good service.
Oh,
But one thing I know too, probably, and that I've seen in some reviews of the book is that you have that, but then a lot of people have, I think, they come back, like they see it as a challenge in certain ways. So, are there which myths that you talk about have probably gotten the most criticism from readers or pushback in different ways?
Oh, definitely. This my disagreement with the Santa Claus lie. So in chapter 6, I argue that parents should not lie to their children about Santa Claus.
Hmm.
And that's like I wrote an op-ed for the Baltimore Sun back in 2009. I think that's how long I've been doing this. And whoa, you talk about vitriol. I mean, I really heard it. I got all kinds of email and snail mail and really unusual stuff. And so and I've continued to post about it on my Psychology Today blog and done some guest posts for some other places and podcasts and that kind of stuff. And I get a lot of pushback on that because people really, a lot of people will disagree and think it's perfectly fine to lie to their kids about Santa Claus. But I will also add that I also get, really it's kind of averaged out over the years, I get just as much, what was the right word, fan mail as I do hate mail. A lot of parents, a lot of people emailed me saying, "Oh, I'm so glad to have found this. I totally agree. I thought I was the only one. I'm so glad to see someone else is on my side and making the kind of arguments that I want to make. My friends who disagree with me, I'm going to show them your article and explain why I do this. I'm not crazy for not wanting to lie to my kids about Santa. There are legitimate worries here." And so, people kind of, because it's so socially taboo to not lie to your kids about Santa, people kind of hide the fact that they don't participate in this, and so it leaves one with the impression that they're the only ones that don't do it. When in fact it's a lot more common than you think. There are a lot, and I found this out as I've just canvassed friends and heard from people that there's a lot more people that have the problems I have with the Santa lie and don't participate in the Santa lie than you think there are. So you're not alone out there. If you're listening to this and you don't lie to your kids about Santa, you think it's a bad thing, you're not alone. There are other people out there. You just got to find them.
That's pretty fun. Did anyone come up, like you said, you've gotten a ton of responses to that. Has anyone given you a good counter that you really think, not that maybe changed your mind, but that actually, gave you some pause? Because one thing I like is that you've got all that, the long list of common objections in the book, which I like. I thought that was a fun way to go at it. But did anyone after that was published, has anyone come up with anything new that made you think a little harder?
Not that I recall. The only one that I found moderately convincing, I think I actually mentioned in the book, which is you need to teach children to be skeptical of authority figures. And so the best way to do this is to be an authority figure in their life and then lie to them. And then they'll learn from that you shouldn't trust authority figures, right? Which I think kids should have a healthy, kind of skepticism of authority figures. They should, learn that often people lie to them, and so they need to investigate things for themselves and come to rational conclusions on their own. I think that's a good thing. But I do think they can learn that without their parents lying to them. That children should be able to trust their parents, and it's good for children to trust their parents. I think they're not being lied to by their parents and stuff. So that's my reply. But that's the most convincing argument I've seen.
That's gotcha. Well, one thing that happened actually after I read that, and that I didn't realize I was going to have to face this year. I've got two boys at very different ages, and the older one, of course, knows what's up, and the younger kid is still sort of on the cusp of believing. And I found myself in this odd situation this year of, okay, do I make my older son participate in the lie this year? And that's an even more complicated spin. It's like not just myself and the child, but now I'm making my other child deceive his brother when that's precisely not what we teach him to do any other time of the year. So.
Right.
Yeah, that was a different spin on it.
I haven't thought about that angle. That's another kind of worry that you have there, right? Is you end up like you're not only teaching some bad lessons, I think, to the kid you're lying to, but you could also be teaching some bad lessons to the kid you're making lie.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I like it.
So while you were researching, I'm curious. I mean, it seems, and I hope it's coming across in your book correctly, that you really do have a big fond love of a lot of things about Christmas. It doesn't seem like there's, this is not, a total attack or anything like that.
Absolutely, yeah. Like I try to make that clear at the front of the book that I celebrate Christmas. I put up Christmas lights. I really enjoy Christmas. That's why I studied it, is because I like it, and my study didn't change that. Gotcha.
So one thing I was curious about is while you were doing a lot of the research, did anything that you had previously enjoyed get ruined in any way? Like, did anything for you personally get kind of demythologized in a way that you didn't necessarily expect?
Well, certainly things got demythologized for me, but that didn't decrease my enjoyment of them. That increased my enjoyment of them. Mm-hmm. Maybe I am strange this way, but I have trouble enjoying something in that way unless I really feel like I understand where it came from and why I'm doing it.
Gotcha.
Right? So, kind of a side point, but I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings, but I never was completely satisfied with the story because I wanted to know how all this came about and how everybody, I wanted everybody's backstory. I wanted to see what they were, right? And so I read the Silmarillion, and I read all this information about where these characters come from to kind of understand, how the War of the Ring finds its place in this world and what it's really about, right? And then I find it so much more satisfying to, when I see something happen. Like I find when Gandalf fights the Balrog, I know what a Balrog is and where they came from and why it's in the mountain, and that's such a much more satisfying part of the story than just this kind of cool monster, right? So the same thing is true for Christmas, right? Like, we do all of these things. Why do we put up a dead tree in the middle of our living room at the end of December and put lights on it, right? Like, what purpose does that serve? It's a very strange thing. Why do we pretend to fool our children into believing that a big giant fat man in a red suit will come by, but only when they're sleeping, and and deliver presents? Like, why do we? That's a strange thing. Why do we do this? Why do we give kids presents? Why do we? Where's the red and green come from? Why mistletoe? Why in the world do we think that we have to kiss people when we're underneath mistletoe? Like the tradition itself was never good enough for me. I wanted to know where these things came from, and then once you find out where they come from, I find them so much more enjoyable. I think it's like, I understand exactly what we're doing with the Christmas tree. I know where it comes from. It makes sense. I understand the tradition. And so I just find it. So it does demythologize it for me, but to me it makes it more enjoyable to understand where it's coming.
Gotcha. No, I appreciate that. Like I was telling you that I've got all of these cards that I think kind of on the blog people make fun of, and that's part of the fun that we have with doing that. And a couple years ago, somebody challenged me, and they were like, you seem like all you're doing is making fun of the holidays and like not taking anything seriously. And I actually wrote a long response saying, no, I think that actually, showing these things and laughing at how it changes over time and playing with the anachronisms actually is, a way to celebrate that stuff and a way to sort of engage with it in a way that it really, in a way, respects the history and, with a smirk, but still,
Right.
is a better way to come at it rather than, keeping a myth. Yeah. So, well, good.
Along that line, one of my favorite things we were talking about before we started to hit record, Grossman's Christmas Curiosities book.
Yes. Yep.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of it, there's these strange Christmas cards that are of the dead birds.
Yes, indeed.
Right? Like, it's just like, here's a dead bird. Merry Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? It's just the weirdest thing. It's those little curiosities like that are just so fun to look at and try to figure out what's going on. And I understand that. I tried to find those out. I think even Grossman says it's kind of a mystery as to why these things are Christmas cards.
Yeah, no, he says that the best he could do, I think, there was that maybe it was supposed to elicit sympathy, because, your Victorian era sympathy is supposed to be a big thing, and you're supposed to feel bad for the bird, and that
right. could
be. One thing I actually think I might have him figured out, and I've tried to tell people this before, but there's an old Celtic tradition called the Wren Day that would happen during that time, where part of what they do is they'd go out and find a bird and kill the bird, and then there would be a parade around the town, and it would kind of be like a part of the wassailing tradition.
Okay.
And so I was wondering, like, is there still, but you'll see apparently in certain Celtic images, birds and dead birds, and never necessarily associated with Christmas cards, but I was curious if there was still supposed to be, if we're talking about 100, however many years ago, if there was still just enough of a resonance with that it could still have some kind of, obvious meaning when someone sees it. And for us, it's just so anachronistic that we don't get it at all.
Right.
I have no idea if that's true, but it's the best I could come up with.
That sounds pretty good to me. That sounds better than Grossman's explanation, I think. So I'd never heard of Wren Day, but that's fascinating. It's good stuff.
Best I've got, but I found a few others. I think he has 2 in there. I think I've got 4 of those cards now. So total of just dead birds. That's great. Those are the best things. Well, good. Well, speaking of sort of going back in the past like that, Santa is one that I really particularly enjoyed that chapter, because I've done a lot of reading about, Santa traditions and arguments about relationship to St. Nicholas and how close Santa Claus is to a Christian tradition. And you have a lot about that. And would you mind sort of giving what you take your best sort of approach to, I guess, call it the genealogy of Santa Claus at this point? Where do you think, based on what you've researched, where do you think he comes from?
Yeah, so this is actually where the book kind of finds its origins. What first inspired the book was me reading this self-published book called A Heathen's Guide to Christmas. And I found it on Amazon somewhere, and it was some grad student, William Hooper, I think is the name of the kid, who wrote it, and I looked at that, and it was fascinating. I learned all these fascinating things, and then, but it was self-published. I wasn't sure if it was actually true. And so I started, tracking down his sources to try to figure out if it was and this led me down this just rabbit hole, right? I ended up reading, Skeefer's book and Nessenbaum's book, and then it just, after book after book after book. And I found that, I think, if I remember correctly, a lot of what Hooper says is not entirely accurate. At least I couldn't confirm a lot of what it says. But in a lot of the kind of general stroke things were right. So to answer your question more directly here, so what is the history of Santa Claus? I think that ultimately, I think Skeefer's right. So Skeefer, we had mentioned this in an email. Skeefer's got this book called Santa Claus Laughs at the Wild Men,
Mm-hmm.
where she argues that the precursor to Santa Claus is this old fertility god that was supposed to be half man, half beast. And that this tradition took on numerous forms, especially in Europe. And that essentially this thing survives through the Middle Ages until the Christians come upon it, and then they try to Christianize it, and it doesn't quite work right. And so Christianize is not the right word. They try to incorporate it into their mythology, but they don't try to, like so many other pagan gods, they just tried to saint, right? They just tried to literally Christianize them in that they would turn them into part of their pantheon,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they would take, Mars become Saint Martin, and I'm trying to think of some other ones. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's a number of Catholic saints that were never actually historical people at all. They were just these pagan gods that the church declared as saints. And that they didn't exactly do that with, they sort of did that with the wild man. They tried to demonize him at one point to keep people from worshiping him, and literally demonize him, as in they declared him to be the devil. And this is why the devil is typically depicted with horns and hooves and a tail and a pitchfork, is because usually the half beast that the wild man was a goat. So he was, he had cloven hooves and a pitchfork. Pitchfork was a fertility symbol, but he had the horns and that kind of stuff. And that's why the devil looks like he does today, is because he's based on the wild man. But they also made him the slave of a saint, Saint Nicholas. But as I don't want to give away too much in the chapter here, but I argue in the book that I don't actually think that Saint Nicholas was an actual historical figure. I think that he was like these other saints. He's just a sainted version of a pagan god, and the pagan god that he's a saintly version of is the wild man. The wild man was often called Claus. This is in Germanic peoples, and Claus is short for Nicholas, Niklaus, in German. And if you were to saint the Claus, the wild man, you would call him Saint Niklaus. And that when he first appears, like the historical evidence for Saint Nicholas is not very good at all. And when Nicholas first appears, he already has this weird wild man type figure in tow. He is the Punisher, basically, for Nicholas's good side, and it seems that they're interchangeable in a lot of places. And then it's really from that Saint Nicholas comes, and then essentially, like, the very, very short version of the story is that Saint Nicholas and his demonic helper, who visit people's houses around December 6th in Europe for various reasons. There's a whole other story there. Get combined into one single character called Belsnickel. The Pennsylvania Germans were very fond of, which I go and see every year. I go see a Belsnickel every year at Kutztown, Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's great. In fact, there's a picture of you with one, isn't there, at the end of the book? I think you haven't, Yeah,
that's right. That's the Belsnickel. He actually has horns now.
Oh.
Like the picture I have, he wears, that's good stuff. And that our image of Santa mostly comes from Clement Clark Moore's poem "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," originally called "A Visit from St. Nicholas," and that it seems that he's mostly borrowing from the Belsnickel tradition. His fur from his head to his foot, his sooty appearance, his bag full of treats, all of that seems to be borrowed from the Belsnickel tradition. And so there's like kind of a rough history of where Santa Claus comes from. And the really cool part of it is this helper that St. Nicholas has, which he still has in Europe. St. Nicholas has not gone away. He still exists in Europe. But when he appears in places in Europe, like in Germany, especially Austria, he usually has this demonic helper in tow. In Austria, he's called Krampus, and he is the most horrible, terrible thing you've ever seen. He's awesome. He basically is this demonic goat man with horns sticking out of his head. They have these wooden masks that are terrifying. They drag chains behind them so you can hear them. He usually has big, giant cowbells wrapped around his waist. He can literally be dragging a bowl like a pot of fire behind him in these Krampus parades. It's just terrifying. You can look it up online. And Krampus has kind of made a comeback. I have a list in the chapter of all these different places that Krampus has started appearing in pop culture.
Oh yeah.
He hosted a cartoon fiasco on Comedy Central or Cartoon Network the other year, and he's kind of become a pop culture icon, which is kind of cool.
It is, and one thing I think is fun about that too is that people will then look back and say, oh yeah, in Europe, Krampus is he's like Santa Claus's helper. But if Skiefer and what you're talking about is right, Santa Claus is Krampus, right? I mean, he's coming. Yeah. He has way more in common with Krampus than Saint Nicholas. Right. The fur and the punishing, the bells, the jingle bells that you hear. Those are basically echoes of the chains. Right, that's right. Oh, I remember that. Yeah, yes. Yeah, right. Krampus had the chains, and that's how you would know St. Nicholas was coming, because you could hear his helper he had in chains behind him. When the Pennsylvania Germans combined Nicholas and Krampus into one character and turned him into Belsnickel, those chains turn into bells. But you still hear him coming when you hear the bells jingling. And still today, you hear Santa is coming when you hear the sleigh bells. But it all traces back to Krampus's chains. Especially if you're just talking about the historical Saint Nicholas, all Santa has in common with him is a moniker.
He sometimes is called St. Nicholas, right, or
Right.
Jolly St. Nick, right? And the December visiting. But even the December visiting is something that Krampus did too. And so, like not even that he has in common with him. So yeah, he has way more in common with Krampus than he does with St. Nicholas, most definitely.
That's great. That's fun. Well, I'm curious, sort of not to ask you to go beyond the book a little bit, but I know I've already heard so many friends sort of talk about, not necessarily looking forward to, Christmas this year with their extended families because of politics or because of other differences that are going on.
This is going to be real interesting Thanksgiving and holiday season.
Well, I have two sides to a question, I guess. One, I'm sort of curious. Does in your hope, I would imagine that, part of your hope is that understanding the wider variety of traditions that go into Christmas can kind of make it easier for other people to see different traditions and sort of make them their own and be maybe more responsible or more respectful of different traditions and of other people's traditions. But do you think that maybe, taking that approach to Christmas traditions and learning more of the history could actually help with easing up on our own sort of, self-righteousness about certain types of traditions that we take?
Well, yeah, certainly with the self-righteousness about traditions, right? I don't know if this is going to solve any political disputes, but it will. I think, so there's a couple of reasons that I lay out the history. So there's 3 chapters. The book's kind of laid out where I have a chapter on history of the holiday, and then I relate that to some issue like the war on Christmas, another chapter on on Christmas history at a different time, and then relate that to some other kind of issue of modern day Christmas, right? It's kind of laid out that way, and I think that the reason I spend so much time on the history is I think that it's really important to understand it for a couple of reasons. One is that when you understand where traditions come from, it's much easier to give them up when they are harmful, right? So, like one of the examples I used at the very beginning of the book is how idiot Americans used to light candles in their Christmas trees, and it would burn down the tree and burn down their house, right? And literally people were dying because of this Christmas tradition of putting candles, like cutting down a dead tree, putting it in your living room, and putting candles in it. That's stupid. That's really stupid, especially when your house is made of wood, right? But people just kept doing it. It was killing people. People kept doing it because, hey, it's tradition, right? If they had merely realized that whenever that tradition was coming to be used in the early 1800s in America, that tradition was really only about 100 years old, and that it wasn't even that popular in Germany until around the same time it was becoming popular in America, and that the only reason that the Germans would light candles in a tree in their house is because their houses were made of stone, so that if the tree burnt down, it wasn't a big deal. It wouldn't catch their entire house on fire. Then they might maybe think this doesn't date back hundreds of years. It's something that someone made up recently. Well, then I don't need to do that. It's so much easier to give up a tradition once you realize that someone made it up a couple days ago, right? And so that's one reason I have for exposing the history of it. Is just once you realize that a tradition is harmful, it makes it easier to give it up. Okay, so the second reason, though, that I talk about the history of it, and part of the one of the things I expose about the history of it is that no one really has a claim on Christmas or what Christmas is or how it's properly celebrated. So it's very commonly assumed that it's a Christian holiday, and so that if you don't have Christ in your Christmas celebrations, you're doing it wrong because, Christ is right there in the name and it's part of, and that just historically, that's just not true. The December celebrations certainly predate when Jesus would have been born by quite a few hundred years. Really, December celebrations predated by a couple thousand years. That people were celebrating in much the same way that we do now in December, long before Jesus would have been born. And that even the early church didn't even celebrate Christmas. Once Rome became Christianized, the Christians tried to appropriate it, but really it continued to be celebrated in secular ways all the way through the Middle Ages, so much so that the Puritans tried to stamp it out because it was so secular. And it's never been celebrated primarily in a Christian way. And so when you realize that it's not that it's bad to celebrate it in a Christian way, if you're a Christian and you want to celebrate it that way, that's perfectly fine. But it's also not bad to celebrate it or improper to celebrate it in a non-Christian way, right? And so once you understand the history of the holiday and where the traditions come from, it's so much easier to say, I celebrate Christmas my way, you celebrate Christmas your way, and neither one of us is doing it right or wrong. It's just the way we choose to celebrate. It's what works for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that can really lead to a lot more tolerance in people, and just recognizing that people just have different ways of celebrating. There's no right or wrong way to celebrate. There could be more harmful ways to celebrate. We can talk about that if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But in regards to like what's proper and what's not, there's no right or wrong answer to that. So Christians can keep Christ in Christmas. Non-Christians cannot have their Christmas celebrations have anything to do with Christ at all, and both are perfectly legitimate.
Gotcha. Well, that being said, do you have any ideas about what's going to happen with the war on Christmas now? You think we're going to start seeing more of it?
Yeah,
you think that rhetoric's going to be ramped up?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, we're so inaugurations, right, in January, right?
Right.
We may be so preoccupied with Trump and his cabinet and what's going to happen before Inauguration Day that everyone may just forget about the war on Christmas, right? Like, so, like, it could be a non-issue this year, right? But then again, if like all it would take is one single Trump tweet about being mad about the war on Christmas or whatever, and it could blow up bigger than it ever has before, right? So I mean, it's just a crapshoot. Who knows what's going to happen?
Well, I'm just hoping we get some good Trump Christmas cards out of it. That's what I'm hoping.
I thought about that, right? Like, there's got to be some good Trump Christmas cards coming out of this at some point.
Lots of gold leaf and yeah.
Yep. But I mean, the nation's obviously more polarized than it ever has been, and the war on Christmas really is, derives from that polarization. So it could get pretty bad, but then again, we could be just so preoccupied that no one even notices.
Indeed. Well, hopefully, though, we'll all get a little break, hopefully, around Christmas time, and the family conflicts won't be as bad as I know some people are afraid they may be. So.
Yeah, I've already heard stories about people, like, ramping up and getting ready for arguments and conflicts and stuff like that, because there's just going to be no way to avoid it this year.
I've got a couple friends who are already planning on separate Christmases, so which is not what you wanted, but maybe is good at least this year. So.
Yeah.
Well, Kyle, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I just want to tell everybody else, it's Kyle Johnson. The book is The Myths That Stole Christmas. Fun read. I mean, funny stuff all the way through, but also really informative. One thing I appreciate is you do a great job of not only making your own case really well, but also doing, I think, a really excellent job of summarizing a lot of the other stuff that's been written out there about the holidays, which I think also makes this book sort of doubly useful because, I mean, like Skeever's book and a lot of the Battle for Christmas book and a bunch of other things, you really get to the heart of those really well, which I think is great for those who are interested.
Thanks.
So.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, the book ended up coming out of, so my research on Christmas was motivated by that the book I talked about before, The Pagan's Guide to Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
That turned, however, into a class. Like, I ended up, like, all the research ended up motivating a class I teach here at King's, where we did read Skeefer and Nussenbaum and Forbes and a whole bunch of other Christmas books. And I've read them all like multiple times because I've taught this class multiple times. And so I ended up just like, I'll just put it all into one book. So that's all kind of, I don't forget it. It's all summarized there. And so that's why there's, kind of such reliance on those other sources. But yeah,
gotcha.
Thanks for that compliment.
Absolutely. You should work on getting the great courses to do a Christmas course.
I have pitched it to him.
Oh, yeah?
So, yes. I've even tried to just do let me give one lecture and
Edit.
just make it available for free or something
right,
at
on your app or whatever. I haven't had any
gmail.com.
traction with it yet. So as you mentioned, I'm also a professor for the great courses. I've got 2 courses there, one called Exploring Metaphysics, the other one called the Big Questions of Philosophy, neither of which have anything to do with Christmas, but both of which take a kind of similar approach where I'm trying to summarize neatly other people's arguments, but then also give my own, my own take on things, my own case on things, and I've definitely you guys need a class. Even if it's just 6 lectures, or even just 1 lecture that you could do, you guys really need a lecture on Christmas.
Absolutely. Well, I've noticed on their Facebook page they've started to do little one-off live videos every now and then,
Oh, that's right.
Which I've seen, and I hadn't thought of that. But that might be something, and they record them. Those are certainly recorded and available later. But I've gotten to, just be around when they sent out the notice that one's going live, and they've been some good stuff. So I don't know. Maybe I
forget. Do they do them in studio, or do they do them?
Yes. It seems like they have a studio set up, but then I think they've had people Skype in or video conference in one way or another to give it. They're certainly not the sort of polished, multiple camera things that are on the recordings. But I don't know. Maybe if I send a note saying, "Hey, why not something on Christmas?" and people who listen to this do one, maybe we can get you in there. That might be fun.
Yeah, do that. Everybody who wants to see this, yes, email the Great Courses and say you really need to do something on Christmas, and it needs to be David Kyle Johnson.
There you go.
And I'm gonna email my contact there right now and pitch this idea to him.
Good.
We'll see where it goes.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks, Greg.
Yep. So please go buy his book. I think, like I said, it's an excellent summary of all kinds of great history that's been done, as well as a lot of sort of crazy things that people have said and thought about Christmas. Well, guys, I hope you really enjoyed this. If you do have any suggestions for what other things might be fun on our podcast, please let me know at any of the sites where you follow this stuff, or send me an email at weirdxmas@gmail.com, and that'll get straight to me. Otherwise, guys, thanks a lot for listening. Look forward to the next one, when hopefully we'll have lots of fun, strange, odd music for the holidays. Take care.
Doodly doodly